I'm Casey Cook with Biz Technology Solutions, and today we're going to talk about the future of remote work and managing cyber risks. So just to start, if you are not familiar with BizTech, we are a managed service provider. We generally work with small to medium-sized businesses, and whether you have internal IT or you have no IT, we will usually work with them, work with you on your business to kind of streamline all of your IT and kind of manage it for you. We are based out of Mooresville, North Carolina, with locations in Charlotte and Greensboro as well. And like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about managing cyber risks for your remote workers. And I'm Casey Cook, and we have joining us too, Michael Veruso from Corvid Cyber Defense. So I'm going to start off with a little demo to show you guys, and then Mike is going to kind of take the reins and go over those 5 steps with you. So give me 1 second, we'll transition over to the demo here. All right. So what we're looking at right now is a Windows 10 machine. And just to kind of clarify what I'm doing here, I'm going to give you a little brief overview. It's kind of a trivial example, but example of how your users can be phished and what that's going to look like on the attacker side, but also on your user side. I know we see all these different ransomware attacks and all these cybersecurity incidences that are taking place, but we very often don't see kind of like what takes place behind the scenes. And so I'm just going to go through a little brief example of what that could look like. So this is our Windows 10 machine. This is going to be our victim in this instance. And then over on the other side, we have a Kali Linux machine. Kali Linux is a version of Linux. It's just a free operating system, so anybody can download and use it. And it's very commonly used for penetration testing, which is when somebody's trying to test the security of a network or of different servers and systems, but also by a lot of attackers as well. And the reason is because there are a lot of different tools that come prepackaged with this operating system that are meant for attacking computers. So to start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a terminal. And again, kind of a trivial example, but I'm going to use something called SE Toolkit. And so this is SE standing for Social Engineer. This is a toolkit that comes pre-installed on here, and it's a quick way of creating a piece of malware. So you see we have a few options here. I literally just have to type in a few numbers, and I'm able to generate a listener, as they call it, or a piece of malware that I could send to a victim via email. And then once they open that, it's going to kind of create a connection to my machine. So again, I've done a little groundwork, so we don't have to worry about too much with this and going through the whole creation of it. But let's pretend that we're over on our victim machine here, and we receive an email that looks something like this. So we receive this security alert that says it's from Avast, and they say that you have 2 deadly Trojans in your mailbox, and you need to download a quick scan tool to be able to scan your computer to get access to those. Or to remove those, sorry. So I went ahead and clicked that link. I downloaded this Avast Quick Scan tool. Before I run that, I'm actually going to go back over to our Kali Linux machine, go back to our terminal. I'm going to launch something called the Metasploit Framework. Once that loads, I'm going to tell it to use an exploit called spell it correctly, multi-handler. And then I need to tell it what I'm attacking. So I'm going to tell it to set the payload as a Windows machine. Use autocomplete. So what I'm essentially doing is I created that piece of malware, and what I'm going to do is set up this kind of open door on this attacker's machine so that when that piece of malware is launched on a machine, it's going to connect back to mine. So before I do that, I do need to set a few options. So you can see the 2 that I'm going to set here are the listening address and the listening port. So again, I'm going to set the IP address of this machine that we're on. And then set the listening port. And so if you're not familiar with some of these technical terms, what I'm doing is, we can think of this as almost like a mailing address. So at your house, you have an address so that people, when they want to send you mail, they're going to send it to this specific address. So whether you're on the open internet or in an internal network, you're going to have an IP address that is telling somebody how they can reach you. And from there, I'm setting a port. You can think of this port as like a window or a door that's kind of open, or that we can open and close to that machine or to that address. So most systems have about 65,000 different ports, and usually not all of those are going to be open. You can kind of control access to them. Some very common ones are port 80 that you use when you're connecting to some unsecure websites, or when you're connecting to like an HTTPS site, you're connecting over port 443. But we can kind of control, like on this one, I'm setting the port to 4445, so that now when I run this, it's going to go ahead and create an listener for us. You see it says it's connecting or listening on that address and port. And then over on the Windows 10 machine, now when I launch this, from our side as the victim, it's not going to look like anything's happening. We're clicking on this tool that we downloaded to scan our machine, but nothing's really taking place. So maybe it's broken, maybe I didn't download it correctly. But hey, we have this big project or something that we're trying to finish, so I'm not going to worry about that. I'll come back to that later. But actually, if we look over on our Kali machine, we notice that it's now created this connection to that machine. So from here, I actually have a direct connection. So I could do something like pwd, which tells it to print the working directory. It tells us that it's in the users, kcook being my name, in the downloads folder. And if we look at our Windows 10 machine, that's actually where we launched that malware from. And so now this person has control of that victim machine. I can do a lot of different things. One very common thing could be start a keylogger. So what I can do is type key scan start. You'll see it starts sniffing for keystrokes. So over on a Windows 10 machine, let's say we are going to log into our Office 365 account. So I'll just click sign in. We'll type out our address. So I'm just going to use one of the demo accounts that I have. Oops. And then I'm going to type our password. So now I'm signed into my Outlook account here. I'm on Office 365. So we go back over to our Kali machine. What I can do is tell it to dump anything that's been listening to. So just key scan dump. You'll see now that we see where Alan had typed in his email address. I guess there I spelled one, so I had to go backspace and go to type the 4. And then now we see the password in plain text as well. Office 365 demo exclamation point. So again, in not just that, not being able to sniff keystrokes, there are all sorts of other things we could do, like even send kind of commands to that machine. So if I do keyboard send, I'll just make sure I open up like a notepad here so we can see what it looks like. I can actually tell this to send a command to that machine if I wanted to. See, it types it out for us. And there's a lot of other things that you could do with this. You see there's a whole sorts of different things we can do as far as getting screenshots, kind of watching the desktop. Even if there was a webcam that was connected to this machine, we could actually list out the different webcams, take a snapshot from the webcam, or even stream what's taking place on the webcam. So again, it's just very much a problem if somebody was able to get that piece of malware to run on that machine. And one of the biggest issues, especially with some of the non-traditional, the traditional antiviruses that we have, is they don't often pick up some of those malware. So you saw, I just selected a few options when we were looking at that SE toolkit, and it generated this kind of piece of malware for us. I'm running that through this site called VirusTotal. And so what VirusTotal does is it has about 71 different antivirus products that it looks at, and it takes a signature of that piece of malware, which is what you see up at the top here. And then based on that signature, it runs it through those different antiviruses to see which ones would detect it as malicious. And so, out of the 71 that they have, 56 isn't bad, but you'll see down at the bottom, there's still a decent amount of, antiviruses that don't even notice that this is a piece of malware. And so one of the biggest issues we see is that there's so many pieces of malware being generated each day. A lot of them are being just kind of hand-coded by these attackers and hackers. And if that being the case, I'm sure if we hand-coded one, it might be 10 or less of these machines that are these antiviruses that would pick up that as a piece of malware. So it's just very important to make sure that we're trying to protect our users, make sure they understand the risks when they're downloading and clicking things in email, and then also make sure we have that endpoint protection to better protect ourselves too. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Mike now.
So you scared me now. So I'm going to go ahead and try to save the day and educate the audience here on some things that they can do to prevent these types of attacks that you just launched so easily. So I appreciate it. So again, just to introduce myself, Mike Veruso here. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer here at Corvid Cyber Defense. I do what we do here is we help a lot of small to medium businesses with security, and we partner with organizations like Biz Tech to help augment and help provide those services to their end clients. So I'm going to dive in a little bit, and I'm going to kind of give you 5 steps of a cybersecurity plan, but always before we start with the 5 steps, it's always good to kind of lay the groundwork a little bit of what's going on. Now that we're still in the midst of COVID-19, and a lot of us have gone home to work. We've been working from home. It's caused a lot of disruption in our lives, as well as even within our businesses.
Hey, Mike, I hate to interrupt you, but you're not sharing your PowerPoint at the moment.
Oh, sure. Yep. Right. Go. Awesome. Thanks, Casey.
Yeah, no problem.
It's always good to have an engineer on the line to help. So what I'd like to do is kind of just talk a little bit about the differences between the office environment when it comes to cybersecurity versus the home environment. So I've put together a little bit of a depiction here, but this is kind of just normal activity of how we interact with our assets and computers while we're in the office, right? So we have a user here, we'll call her Susan, for lack of a better name. And Susan is on her computer, and generally Susan is accessing the corporate network, whether that's over a wired connection or wireless, and is accessing the internet, right? The other thing that Susan is also doing, she's also accessing corporate resources. As we all know, those resources can be anywhere, depending on your business, but they could be in a data center, if they could be in a closet on some servers, or they can be somewhere in the cloud, whether that's in an AWS environment, an Azure environment, or even in a co-location facility somewhere else. But the important thing in here is to note is that Susan has access to a variety of different things. She browses the web where maybe you're using certain types of SaaS applications. Obviously, many people have moved to Office 365 or the G Suite for email. So all of your email is now sitting in the cloud, and Susan has access to all of that. Now, when we're in an office environment, and when I talk about security with a lot of our clients, and when I'm educating folks about security, there are certain areas of security that need to be focused on. And one area is protection. And protection is where you are deploying a multitude of different types of security controls to prevent attacks from actually occurring. So things like firewalls, endpoint security, or antivirus. A lot of people have email security in place to protect certain types of emails that are coming in that might look malicious. Very similar to the password reset or the link that KC showed us around clicking on a link to go ahead and take care of some things that Avast was telling us was incorrect with our antivirus. So we have all of those types of controls in place. And what this is generally, in the world of security, we call this either a layered defense or a defense in depth strategy when it comes to protection. We're sitting behind most and all of these controls when we're in an office environment. So in this example, where an attacker is on the outside trying to get in, there is a great chance that if this attacker tries to penetrate the environment, that we have the right controls and tools in place to actually prevent that from occurring. So very much the type of example that Casey shared generally can be prevented. What happens when we move home, right? It looks very similar. We still have Susan working at her desk. The difference here is Susan is now connecting to her own network in her house that is, for the most part, probably very unsecure. A lot of people have deployed, whether you want to call it an access point or a router or any of those things, a wireless gateway. But for the most part, we have not gone in and changed those, what I call standard passwords that are on those types of appliances that we have deployed in our house. The other thing that's very interesting, and here's where things have really changed, is we are also sharing the network with everybody else in our home. Now, I live in a household with 3 boys from the ages of 11 through 19. My 19-year-old can probably hack into any machine, and I generally don't know what he's doing on his computer. My 11-year-old is constantly taking my wife's computer and always trying to get his hands on my computer to have access to whatever he's doing. And what has kind of magnified this in the world we're in today is that traditionally, when people were working from home, our kids were at school, we weren't necessarily sharing the environment at the same time, but now everybody's home, right? So anything that happens if your child, your spouse, significant other gets infected, there's a high potential that that infection could propagate into a corporate asset that's sitting on the same network, right? And in the same scenario where an attacker is on the outside, what they're really trying to get to, and I always say this notion of the crown jewels, they're trying to get to your most significant assets within your business, right? So when they launch an attack, and if they've compromised somebody else, it's very easy for them to laterally move inside the environment and compromise a business asset, right? And that is the significant difference. And generally in this scenario, because one, we're not sitting behind corporate security controls and we're having access to the internet, things have changed tremendously, and now the attacker can get to our corporate assets. So just kind of an overview of what I just talked about. So kind of a comparison of in the office versus at home, right? When we're in the office, we have layered defenses. We're behind an enterprise firewall with things like intrusion prevention, intrusion detection systems. When we're at home, we're not necessarily behind those same types of controls. Also, when we're in the office, we're generally receiving regular antivirus updates and patches, right? If we're not on the corporate network at certain times and we're only maybe accessing it for certain times for VPN access, we may not be getting all of those updates that are required. Security policies to restrict internet usage. A lot of organizations have put policies on firewalls to not allow access to certain types of applications, i.e., maybe personal email, right? We may have deployed an email security solution for our corporate email, but what about our personal email that we're accessing all the time? The other thing is we're sharing the network in the office with corporate users who are generally, if we have a security awareness and training program, are trained on certain things, on what not to click on, et cetera. Now we're sharing the network with family and who else knows who has access to our network. Case in point, I can access probably about 4 of my neighbors' networks at any given time. 3 of them are unsecure. I can jump on and I can wreak havoc on their entire family's assets that are being utilized. And then the other thing is how are we accessing corporate assets? Is it over a secure network when we're in the office, but when we're at home, we're either a direct internet connection or maybe we have instituted some type of a VPN solution. And then the question is whether the user has the ability to turn that access on or off. And then finally, the defense in depth strategy. When we're in the office, we have that, but at home, what generally occurs is the endpoint becomes the primary line of defense to protect us from certain types of attacks. So going a little bit further and going kind of into the 5 steps. So step 1, secure your home network, right? The first thing you can do is go into your router or your access point or whatever you have deployed and change the default admin password to something that an attacker could not guess. Do a complex password and probably even change the username. Put a strong password in for Wi-Fi access, right? Put in WPA2 type encryption. A lot of routers that are in home networks are not defaulted to do that. So I would suggest going in and getting those things activated. And then finally, computers are a corporate asset, right? And all of our users should consider that as corporate property and shouldn't have other users in their family getting on those machines, right? And also lock your machine. A lot of times we forget to do that when we're at home. We may do it in an office environment. In our organization, if you don't lock your machine, you are going to be banished and embarrassed with what you might see on your screen when you get back to it. And then what can business and organizations be doing from a home network standpoint is issue company computers, right? A lot of organizations have moved people working from home who traditionally do not work from home, and they have allowed them to use their own personal computers for access to corporate data. I would urge organizations to issue company machines that have the right protections and the right controls. Do institute a certain type of VPN or secure access type solution, right? Something that actually sends all of the users' traffic over a secure connection. And then finally is to practice the principle of least privilege. What this means is give access to your users to data and applications that they only need access to. A lot of organizations give access to everything, regardless of where you sit in the organization, what your role and responsibility may be, et cetera. We want to try to institute that principle of least privilege and only give access to the things that we need access to. Secondly, training. As Casey showed you, and this is how most attacks are being launched today, is generally through a phishing type of attempt, right? The first thing in any type of attack is they're going to try to lure the user into clicking on something that looks 100% legitimate. And generally, our users are our first line of defense. And I've always said I always say this: you can either have your users as the problem or the solution to cybersecurity, right? So implementing a cybersecurity awareness and training program. And what I mean by a program is not we're going to do one time each year, we're going to have kind of a training for cybersecurity. It needs to be consistent and continuous. And what that means is your users have to be also tested. Things like launching simulated campaigns of those types of phishing attacks that KC showed you earlier, and testing your users and giving them certain types of very easy to understand type video series training that they can improve their awareness and become better at identifying certain types of attacks. Thirdly is setting up some type of secure access. In the example, one of the examples, and Casey showed you how credentials were stolen, but one of the things that there really isn't, I would say, a technology or a solution to solve for, is that if a user goes onto some website that looks 100% legitimate and goes in to change their password because they thought it was a potential password reset, there is no security solution that is going to prevent them from putting in those credentials. And unfortunately, as we all know, many of us use the same types of login and passwords for our personal information along with our corporate information. So things like password managers can be very effective. So people only have to remember one password and can have different types of passwords that get generated for certain types of applications. The other thing to institute is multi-factor authentication. This can be deployed in a variety of different ways. It can be as simple as a text message for another level of authentication. It can be a mobile application, a token, or even a YubiKey. These are very effective if credentials are compromised in some sort of way. Having that second step in the process is the best way to prevent anybody from getting certain credentials in your organization and having access to information. Fourth, lock down your assets. In that example, perfect example, I always say, and kind of in this graphic, but trying to prevent malicious software is kind of like playing whack-a-mole. As Casey stated or showed you, it's very, very easy to create what's considered a 0-day or a never seen piece of malicious software or malware. The way traditional antivirus solutions work, and you saw a list of them on VirusTotal there, is they always need what's considered a patient zero. And what that means is somebody has to be compromised. Some machine, somewhere across the universe has to be compromised. And then what the antivirus vendors do is they write a signature that basically says, if you see this malicious software, go ahead and block it. The problem with that is there's almost 1 million different unique malware samples being created on a daily basis. You can buy free, or not even buy, you can get free tools out there that allow you to go ahead and create malware, or even take existing malware, right, and change it up a little bit so the antivirus vendors can't recognize it, right? So one of the big suggestions here is to be looking at some of the next generation products out there that don't rely on signatures, also don't rely on updates. Don't rely on you having to download the latest update to actually protect your computer or your servers or what have you. What this does is it uses kind of a machine learning algorithm that doesn't have to have any indication of previous known malware or a signature or something written. It eliminates the patient zero factor that occurs with a lot of the traditional products. And finally, you know, I always say protection controls are critical. The first thing you should ever or want to do in security is to prevent an attack. But if detection fails, it can be catastrophic. As you can see in this example, you know, as I always say, technology is not the only answer. What really needs to occur for any organization is to have skilled people coupled with technology, so when something is detected, it's detected as quickly as possible. I use the Target breach as a perfect example. What occurred during the Target breach was 100% detected. They had the proper tools in place. When they looked through the log files and did the investigation, they saw that the incident was actually detected. The problem is nobody saw it. So it really takes both technology coupled with people who are actually monitoring this activity. There's this notion of the 1-10-60 rule. And as you can see, everything in detection is all about time. The faster you can detect and mitigate an issue, the less impact it's going to have to the business, right? Generally, what's happening in an attack, we're launching a phishing campaign through email, a user clicks on it. Now, here's the deal. The catastrophe is not the compromise of that user's computer. There is not a tremendous amount of information that is valuable, or even locking down that one computer for doing a ransomware attack on a single computer is definitely not catastrophic to an organization. But what is when they get into the data center and start locking down all of their server assets, and potentially stealing that information, right? So the 1-10-60 rule, what it means, and this is what the principle we kind of follow here at Corvid, is 1 minute to detect an intrusion. Then you would be able to investigate fully within 10 minutes, right? And remediate in less than 1 hour. That is a lot faster than the industry average of pretty close to about 200 days before we detect a breach, and then the time that it actually takes to go ahead and contain that breach. So those are my 5 steps. I'm going to pass it on a little bit to KC to talk a little bit about a complimentary dark web scan that we have available. So you got it.
And then I forgot to mention, although it looks most people have figured out where the polls are, that we have polls over there on the right side. If you do have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat there, and we'll try to answer them right now. And then we did just post up that complimentary dark web scan. So if you're interested in that, what it's going to do is we're going to be able to look at any of the information on the dark web. So we have a service that actually looks through different forums, different websites that are there, and looks for credentials that have been leaked. And that just kind of helps us to, from an end user point, where we can see, okay, what are kind of our at-risk users. Maybe they're using passwords that were leaked in 2016 that we still see popping up in 2020, which means they haven't changed them because people are notoriously bad at passwords. And like Mike had mentioned, a password manager, we could look at something like that to help them with just using one password to access their database of passwords, or even using something like multi-factor authentication. So it's just good to understand where your weak points are, especially from a user standpoint, and then helps us focus on what we need to do for end user security and end user training. So any questions, feel free to post those in the chat now. Otherwise, I think that's it for slides. And Sierra, am I missing anything?
I haven't seen any questions at this moment, but what I did put up, KC, was our contact info for anybody who is on the call and wants to reach out to us for additional information, any questions about what we discussed today, and we're always available.
Absolutely. Oh, we got one question here. Any kind of GPOs that would be beneficial for a Windows environment regarding this topic? Depends on what you're trying to accomplish, I guess, with those GPOs. There's tools like the, I'm gonna mess up the name of it now, but Windows Security Baseline Analyzer, I think, is where you can actually look at some of the default things that are being set up, and that kind of helps you create a baseline. But as far as like locking it down, I mean, obviously there's kind of some standard default ones that kind of put like the Windows firewall and make sure that's running. But some of the services like Windows Defender might be turned off if you're using a different antivirus. That may be one that maybe we have a little deeper discussion on. So if you are interested, feel free to send us an email and we can kind of set up a call around that. All right, well, if there's no other questions, thank you everybody for joining. I hope it was beneficial. And again, feel free to sign up for that dark web scan. We can set that up, or send us an email. We'll set up a call with you to kind of talk a little bit more in depth.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.